The Grand Beginning. The Titanic stood like a floating palace at the docks of Southampton, its towering steel frame gleaming under the morning sun. The air buzzed with excitement as passengers arrived, their laughter and hurried footsteps merging into a symphony of departure. Among them was Henry Caldwell, a journalist with an instinct for secrets. He had boarded not for leisure, but because of a cryptic letter he had received days prior, one that hinted at something hidden aboard the ship, something dangerous. As he stepped onto the gangway, his eyes scanned the crowd. The elite of society, bankers, industrialists, and aristocrats, paraded in tailored suits and flowing gowns. Among them, Eleanor Whitmore, the young widow of a railroad tycoon, clutched a velvet-wrapped box, her gaze darting to the shadows as if fearing she was being watched. A few steps behind her, Thomas Wren, a crewman with weathered hands and knowing eyes, adjusted his cap and whispered something to a colleague before disappearing below deck. Something was amiss. Henry could feel it. The first days at sea passed in a blur of grandeur. Lavish dinners, spirited waltzes, and hushed conversations in candlelit corners filled the nights. Yet, whispers crept through the corridors, of missing cargo manifests, locked doors deep in the lower decks, and strange figures seen in the moonlit fog. One evening, Henry found himself in the ship's library, poring over passenger records, searching for connections between names that should not have been together. That was when he noticed Captain Edward Smith, standing near the window, staring into the darkness beyond. His posture was rigid, his fingers gripping a telegram. The flickering lamplight revealed something rare, fear in the eyes of a man who had commanded ships for decades. Before Henry could step forward, a shadow moved at the edge of his vision. Turning sharply, he saw a man in a black coat, his face obscured by the dim light. The stranger hesitated, then slipped a small envelope onto a nearby table before vanishing into the hallway. Heart pounding, Henry reached for the envelope and unfolded the note inside. The ink was smudged, but the words were clear enough. There are those who know, and those who should not. A sudden shudder passed through the ship, barely noticeable but enough to send a ripple through Henry's nerves. He looked again toward the captain, but the man was gone. The note burned in his hand like a silent warning. As he stepped into the corridor, a soft creak echoed from the stairwell above. A woman's voice, Eleanor Whitmore's, murmured something to an unseen companion before she disappeared down the hall. Henry inhaled deeply. The Titanic was more than a marvel of engineering. It was a vessel carrying secrets. And as the waves stretched endlessly before them, he had the sinking feeling that not everyone aboard would reach their destination. The night of the disaster. A biting wind cut through the decks as the Titanic surged through the Atlantic. Midnight approached, and while most passengers slept, Henry Caldwell stood near the bow, gripping the cold railing. He had spent the past hours chasing whispers, fragments of conversation behind closed doors, missing crew members, and the uneasy glances of those who knew more than they admitted. Then the ship lurched. A deep, guttural groan reverberated through the hull. Henry's breath caught as he looked out over the water. A jagged shadow loomed ahead, an iceberg, massive and merciless. A sudden jolt sent him staggering back. The sound of splintering steel ripped through the night, followed by the dull roar of rushing water. Screams erupted. Doors flung open. The Titanic had struck. Henry pushed forward, fighting against the tide of panicked passengers surging toward the upper decks. He spotted Eleanor Whitmore, her face pale, clutching the same velvet-wrapped box from before. She turned sharply, as if searching for someone. When her gaze met Henry's, something like realization flickered in her eyes. Then, she disappeared into the chaos. Crewmen barked orders as lifeboats were lowered. Some passengers hesitated, unwilling to believe the ship was doomed. Others, driven by raw survival, shoved their way forward. Henry caught sight of Captain Edward Smith, his expression eerily calm as he murmured something to his officers before vanishing into the bridge. The Titanic groaned again, tilting further. Water surged through the lower levels. Henry pushed deeper into the ship, searching for answers. Near the cargo hold, he found Thomas Wren, the seasoned crewman, struggling with a locked steel door. "Help me," Thomas urged. "We have to get inside." Henry hesitated, then forced his shoulder against the door. It gave way with a sharp snap. Inside, a lone crate sat in the center of the dimly lit room, its lid already splintered open. The air smelled of salt and something older, something Henry couldn't name. "What is this?" he asked. Thomas swallowed hard. Something that should never have been taken from where it belonged. Before Henry could respond, the ship shuddered violently. A thunderous crack split the air. Screams echoed as the Titanic's great frame began to break. Water poured in, swallowing everything in its path. There was no time for answers. Thomas grabbed Henry's arm. "We need to go. Now." They sprinted back toward the upper decks as the bow dipped further into the sea. Eleanor was there, standing at the edge of a lifeboat, her eyes locked onto Henry's. For a brief moment, she lifted the box in her hands, as if considering whether to take it with her. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she let it slip into the ocean. The ship gave a final, shuddering groan. Henry barely had time to take one last breath before the world tilted, and the sea rushed up to claim him. Survivors and lost truths. The cold was unlike anything Henry had ever known. It gnawed at his bones, seeped into his lungs, and turned his breath into shallow gasps. He clawed his way onto a piece of debris, his fingers stiff with frost. Around him, the Atlantic stretched endlessly, dotted with the desperate cries of those still fighting to stay afloat. Somewhere in the distance, a lifeboat's lantern bobbed on the water, too far to reach. Henry blinked against the freezing spray. His thoughts drifted to Eleanor Whitmore. Had she made it to safety? And what about Thomas Wren, the man who had tried to open that locked door? Had he known what he was risking? The Titanic was gone, swallowed by the sea, but the questions it left behind lingered like ghosts in the freezing air. A low murmur broke through the silence. At first, Henry thought it was the wind, but as he turned, he saw a lifeboat drifting past, just a few feet away. Inside, several passengers sat motionless, their faces eerily blank. The boat rocked gently, but no one moved. Henry gathered his strength and reached for the side of the boat. "Help me," he rasped. No response. Then, one of the figures turned, just slightly. The movement was slow, unnatural. It was a woman, her face half hidden beneath a soaked shawl. Her lips parted as if she were about to speak, but no words came. Instead, a shiver passed through her body, and she lowered her gaze to the dark water below. Something was wrong. Henry let go of the boat. It drifted past, vanishing into the mist, its passengers staring ahead like they were lost in time. Hours passed before the RMS Carpathia arrived. Weak hands pulled Henry aboard, wrapping him in thick blankets, but the cold had settled deep inside him, not just in his body, but in his mind. He scanned the deck, searching for Eleanor. He found her sitting alone near the stern, her face pale, her eyes unfocused. "You survived," Henry murmured, his voice raw. She looked at him, really looked at him, and then shook her head. "Did we?" Henry opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, a crewman rushed past, whispering to another. Henry caught only fragments of the words. "A lifeboat, found adrift, no one alive." Something cold coiled in his chest. Days later, as the survivors reached New York, Eleanor Whitmore vanished. No records of her arrival. No statements given. It was as if she had never boarded the Carpathia at all. Henry tried to move on. He told himself the cold had clouded his mind, that the things he had seen were tricks of exhaustion. But on quiet nights, when the wind howled against his window, he thought of that drifting lifeboat, of its silent passengers and their empty eyes. And somewhere, deep in the ocean, the Titanic still kept its secrets. Ghosts, conspiracies, and the unanswered. The Titanic was gone, but its shadow lingered. Henry Caldwell had survived, but survival did not bring answers, only more questions. Back in New York, newspapers focused on the heroism and tragedy of the sinking, yet Henry noticed something strange. Certain details were missing. Reports of a locked cargo hold? Gone. The lifeboat with silent passengers? Never mentioned. And Eleanor Whitmore, the woman he had spoken to on the Carpathia? She was erased. No passenger records, no accounts of her being rescued. It was as if she had been lost to the sea before ever reaching land. Henry tried to investigate. He reached out to other survivors, asking if they remembered her. None did. Even Thomas Wren, the crewman who had fought to open that mysterious cargo door, had vanished, no sign of him among the rescued. And then the letter arrived. It was slipped under his door at the boarding house where he stayed. No return address, no signature. Inside was a single yellowed page with just 5 words. Stop looking. The sea remembers. Henry felt the chill of the Atlantic all over again. He wasn't the only one haunted. Divers who explored the Titanic's wreckage years later reported strange occurrences, equipment failures, eerie sounds, and shadowy figures glimpsed in the endless blue. Some swore they heard whispers through their radios, voices speaking in languages lost to time. And then there was the lifeboat. Decades after the sinking, a fishing vessel off the coast of Newfoundland spotted a derelict wooden boat floating aimlessly in the waves. Its structure was eerily intact, far older than it should have been. The fishermen pulled it aboard, only to recoil in shock. Inside were remains, impossibly well preserved, as if untouched by time. Among the skeletal fingers of one passenger was a velvet-wrapped box, sealed shut. The crew turned the relic over to authorities, who quickly seized it. No reports were ever released. No follow-ups. The discovery faded into silence. Henry spent his final years in solitude, never speaking of the Titanic again. But one night, before his passing, a neighbor swore they saw him standing at his window, staring into the darkness, whispering a single phrase over and over. She was never meant to be found. And then he was gone. The Titanic remains at the ocean's floor, its ruins frozen in time. But every now and then, strange transmissions are picked up near the wreck site. Faint, crackling voices, distorted by water and static. Some say they are nothing but echoes. Others believe something still lingers in the deep. Perhaps the sea does not forget. Perhaps some doors should never be opened. And perhaps, just perhaps, some passengers never left the Titanic at all.